This is a review of the MadCatz GameCube controller, a third-party controller that was released in the era of the Nintendo GameCube still being in stores, and whether or not it's a viable alternative for non-purists who just want a decent controller to play their GameCube games. The reason non-purists might be willing to consider it is that these Nintendo controllers are really hard to find. They're very expensive if they're in good condition. And if they're not in good condition, then you don't really want them. And of course, I think that's all due to how popular Smash Brothers is even today. Now you might think, why not buy something like this, which is obviously a perfect replica of the outer shell of a genuine Nintendo controller, but sold by some third-party manufacturer on eBay or Amazon. Sometimes they're as little as $5. The answer is these are just real junk. In particular, the joysticks on these are no good. I have found that instead of having analog response, a small movement like this is the same as a big movement like that. That's not how an analog stick is supposed to work, and it's just not pleasant to play with. So these look perfect, but are pure junk. So what about this MadCatz, which clearly doesn't look identical, but could potentially play identical? Well, the most important thing is that these joysticks do work roughly the same. So in other words, a small movement here produces a small movement on the screen, and then as you move the joystick more and more, your character moves faster and faster. So this joystick works perfectly. C-Stick likewise has the proper analog response. This is just a solid piece of rubber here, as opposed to these nice little ribbed bits for your pleasure. But it works just as well. It holds your finger just as nicely. So I think that's different, but fine. Not a problem. What about the buttons? Well, the original GameCube has surprisingly non-tactile buttons. They're kind of soft, but they still feel good. They don't take too much pressure. They don't stick. Just, they work well. The MadCatz has surprisingly a lot more tactility. It's not mushy. It's really, really crisp. It's quite a large travel. I don't know if you can hear how loud it is. Unfortunately, that large travel seems to be combined with a shell that makes them kind of stick a little bit. So that's not great. That seems to really only be the issue with the A button there. The other buttons here are also very tactile, but they don't really stick the same way. So they're okay. But of course, the A button, you know it's the most important button because they made it the biggest. So that's a definite point against this. And things get worse as we move to the top of the controller. So I don't think the Z button on the original Cube is that great either. It's a little mushy. But this one here is sort of equally mushy, and it's a little smaller. So I don't like that. It's maybe only a small decrement there in the performance, but it's not better, that's for sure. Here's where these guys really fall down, though. The trigger buttons are just smooth as butter on the real thing. There's no jerkiness. They release and go in without any resistance, but just the right amount of spring-loaded tension. These guys here have a lot more spring in them, and they drag on the case, so they're kind of jerky. You can sort of see how they can't move them smoothly. So it's just not good, and they sometimes will kind of stick in there. You know, if you just want to binary push them, mash them in, and let them go, they're okay. If they've got so much spring-loaded tension there, it's not really pleasant to do that. So these are a hard pass. I don't like these at all. Also, the potentiometers that read these, at least in this particular one, are bad on both of these. And they're bad in the sense that they work most of the time, but occasionally they register that they've been pressed in when you're not touching them at all. And I think that's just that the potentiometers need to be cleaned, but I haven't gotten around to trying to do that to see if that's the case. In any case, I think that one particular failing is enough to make this one not a good choice. But before we completely give up on this, I do want to point out that there is one area that the MadCatz is preferable in. That's the D-pad. It's a little bigger, and it's just way better. It's much more precise. In the real GameCube, the D-pad it's mushy. It's kind of hard to know that you've actually pressed it. And it's a little bit inaccurate. It's not that hard to like get an up and a left input at the same time, or an up and a right input or whatever. Sorry, I'm getting my left and rights mixed up. Meanwhile, the MadCatz is just perfect. It's just real tactile. It's hard to get a diagonal when you mean to go in one of the cardinal directions. It's really good. So I wish that this one aspect could be transferred over to the real controller. And then the final thing, and this is super subjective, but you can see that the shape is a bit different. The handles are a lot larger. And I think that you could get used to that. There's not clearly a bad thing about that, but it sure does feel different in your hands. You know, it just makes me feel like I'm playing a little off. I think with a few hours, you would completely forget it. So, you know, for the person who just wants to play some freaking games and doesn't have the purist's approach, this is okay. But the fact that the buttons and the triggers work so poorly, I think even a non-purist should care about that, and so I would give this MadCatz a pass. Now, maybe if you can find one to try before you buy, maybe you'd find that that's just my particular used copy, although it doesn't look like, you know, other than like some staining, I don't think this one was all that heavily used, so I doubt that it's worn out. Or maybe you wouldn't be bothered by the things I'm bothered by. But I'm not buying one of these. But there is hope. In particular, the Pelican controllers are a pretty good match to this. So if you're looking to save some money, definitely look into the Pelican GameCube controllers that were sold back in the day when the GameCube was still on store shelves, because they're pretty good.